name's Luke Lombardi. I'm one of the planners of the CLF-LA hub. If this is your first time, thanks for joining. Very excited for the presentation today. Martín Torres, a friend of the hub, a friend of mine, and I'll give a brief intro here, and Laura, feel free to chime in as well. But Martín might not know this, but he actually has a role in the origin story of this hub, because back in March of 2020, actually, it was the first time I ever saw Martín, and he was on the stage with Kate Simonin, encouraging folks to start a local CLF hub. It was the very beginning of people talking about embodied carbon, and that was started a couple months later, this hub, with some of us here. And since then, he's also been quite busy in the embodied carbon world. He worked at Walter P. Moore. He has been a really important contributor to the SC 2050 program, one of the key people in the program mechanics group early on when we were first developing the program. And now he's a researcher, an NSF grant researcher at CU Boulder now, and doing really great work in the realm of probabilistic life cycle assessment. And excited to have him share a bit of his research today with the hub and have a bit of conversation around kind of the nuances of embodied carbon. Laura, anything you'd add, or Martín, you can take it away.
I'm really excited to have Martín present here because I got to work with him a little bit back when he was at Walter P. Moore, and just getting updates on his research as I've seen him at events over the past couple of years. I just think it's like super exciting and super important to what we all do in our practices and how we understand our LCAs. So thanks, Martín.
Thanks, y'all. This is a very, very kind introduction. Excited to be chatting with y'all today. Yeah, so like they mentioned, I'm focusing specifically on probabilistic LCA, or basically kind of the impetus for me trying to understand this space was, when I was working as a structural engineer doing LCAs. And the question is, like, why do different tools give you different answers? What should I do about it? Is everything wrong? How can we have a better understanding of LCA results? So first, I just kind of want to frame the problem that we're addressing. So in terms of individuals in the US, reducing your carbon footprint, there are a couple different strategies that I'm sure many of us are familiar with, from living car-free, adjusting your diet, avoiding flying, that have varying ranges of like the scope of impact that you can have on the order of like thousands of kilograms of CO2 per year. Now, if you're a bit cheeky with it, having one fewer child, if that child is not a staunch environmental advocate, that might lead to more emissions because humans tend to consume things that emit. But then if you're a building designer, if you're doing anything in the building space, and this is an example from an LCA I did while I was at Walter P. Moore, but the scope of impact that you can have just absolutely blows everything else out of the water. And so this is just an 8.3% GWP reduction on a specific project. And this is just one project. In probably a couple of years, there were many more than just one project. So I think it's really important for us as building designers, as people in this space, to realize the scope or the potential for reduction that we have, and this massive responsibility, not just in our day-to-day lives in terms of living car-free and doing these other things, but much more so on the buildings that we're designing. We need building designers, we need people in the building space to measure and reduce embodied carbon on their projects. But how do we do that? So the main tool that people use is called life cycle assessment, LCA. And again, we're talking about embodied carbon, that's greenhouse gas emissions from the building materials. We're not talking about operational emissions from energy use. But LCA, kind of at its most simple, how it works is you have some sort of material quantity estimate for each material in a building. So you figure out how much stuff is there, what type of stuff is it. For each of those materials, you find an embodied carbon coefficient. So what's the history of this material? Where did it come from? What are the emissions that took to get this material from the earth into the building? You multiply those together and then you add them up across materials. So very, very simple, very, very easy calculation. Why would you need to do a whole PhD about this, right? So LCA is typically a deterministic process, just like this. We're ignoring uncertainty entirely. Now, what I mean by that is that in terms of our material quantity estimate, we have a single value estimate in terms of our embodied carbon coefficient, we have a single value estimate. So we have a given amount of steel, we have some specific amount of embodied carbon per kilogram of steel. We multiply that together and we get our total embodied carbon, and then we can add it up across different materials. But that begs the question, how precise are these values? Do we know that it's 7.37 kilograms of steel? Do we know that it's 1.25 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of steel? And to answer that question, I think it's important to figure out, where did we get this data? Where are these assumptions coming from? I will note that my research, this presentation, we're focusing on the embodied carbon coefficient. There is certainly also uncertainty associated with the material quantity estimate. I mean, you think about how a project evolves from SD to DD to CD, and then what changes happen as it's getting constructed. But today we're just focusing on the embodied carbon coefficient. So an embodied carbon coefficient, an ECC, is the resulting total emissions based on all these different processes from different life cycle modules. So we split it up into different categories from the life cycle of a material, starting with the production phase, A1 to A3. This goes through construction, A4 to A5. The use phase, once it's in the building, B1 to B7. End of life, so end of the building life, and then beyond building life. So if you're extending the life of a material beyond that of the building, reusing it or recycling it in some way, that's module D. And these can get categorized in different ways. So A1 to A3 is considered cradle to gate. This is where the majority of emissions happen. This is also where we have generally the highest quality data. There's also cradle to grave, going through end of life. Or you can do cradle to cradle if you're considering how that material exists beyond the building life. But when you do this so this is all the kind of the scope of what an LCA might consider. We're going to focus on the production stage. Again, it's where the majority of emissions happen. It's where we have the highest quality data. And when you do an LCA of a specific building material, a specific building product, these results are communicated in the form of an EPD. Yeah, this is typically A1 to A3, but this is the scope that we're focusing on. So EPDs vary in scope. You can have generic EPDs, you can have supply chain or product specific EPDs. A generic EPD might be what you've seen from NRMCA. So they kind of take their best guess at this strength of concrete in this region looks something like this. Here's our best estimate of what that looks like. So it's kind of trying to capture a range of different concrete products. And then on the other side of the spectrum, we see supply chain specific or product specific EPD. So this is an EPD for an exact mix of concrete from a specific plant. But the reason that this is a spectrum and not just 2 points on a line, or just 2 separate points, sorry, is the source data for a supply chain specific EPD can also vary in scope. So maybe it's relying on very specific measurements taken at that facility. Maybe it's relying on more generic data. Maybe it's relying on some sort of assumptions to inform that specific concrete mix. So the whole point of this is there's a big range in scope in terms of these EPDs. Not all EPDs are created equal. Some of them are informed differently. Some of them are much more specific to specific processes. And part of the problem is that designers, when faced with product-specific EPDs or industry average EPDs, is which one do you pick? And we don't necessarily have, we certainly don't have EPDs for all materials or all products. So if I don't have an EPD, do I pick a deceptively precise industry average EPD that's based on data that I haven't seen? Or do I pick a potentially inaccurate EPD that represents maybe a similar product to what I'm using, but not the exact product that's going into my building? So many products don't have EPDs. So if you don't have a specific EPD for what you know you're going to use in your building, like which one of these do you pick? This uncertainty can be particularly relevant in early stage design. So if you're just starting a project, you might know, like, well, I know I'm going to have a 4 KSI mix for whatever sort of assembly, but I don't know who I'm going to get it from. I don't know where it's coming from. And so how do we reflect that uncertainty rather than picking kind of a potentially incorrect value? And any of these deterministic methods, so if I'm in any way picking a single value, that's hiding the underlying uncertainty. So what other data is available? What other information might go into this decision? So what if we created a probabilistic model to represent this uncertainty? Now, if we think about just fitting a distribution that, and this is what people have often done in the scientific literature, it often hides characteristics of underlying data set. So if we have a couple data points and they're normally distributed, that looks like a pretty good characterization. But if the data is bimodal, then maybe it's not as appropriate. If it's a large data set, maybe this looks good. If it's a small data set, should these look the exact same? If it's right skewed, should we pick a right skewed distribution? If it's left skewed, should we pick a left skewed distribution? But this gives us a lot of decisions to make around how can we more aptly characterize a data set of EPDs? How do we create a probabilistic model that reflects all these underlying statistical characteristics? So in my method, what I use is it's called kernel density estimation. And we're using that to create a probabilistic distribution of these embodied carbon coefficients. So that begs the question, what is KDE and how do we use it? So the method that I'm introducing here is called KL1. What that means is KDE-driven lifecycle assessment version 1. We'll talk about version 2 in a little bit. But we're using KDE to create these models. And here's kind of what that looks like. So at the bottom here, those little notches are our individual embodied carbon coefficients. So we have our data set. On top of each of those, we place a kernel. In this case, it's a normal distribution centered on each embodied carbon coefficient. And then we add them up to get our probability density function that has an area of 1. So then that is our resulting probabilistic model based on the data set. As an example, here's what it looks like applied to a set of glass embodied carbon coefficients. So looking at the data set, we have 66 EPDs for glass. Now, just looking at, before we fit anything, looking at the data set, we can kind of see it's a little bit bimodal. We can see 2 clusters. We can also see 2 values kind of out to the right. So it's a little bit right skewed. And so there's these kind of funky underlying characteristics that we want reflected in our probabilistic model. So when we use KDE, it fits very closely to what we think the data looks like. So it's capturing the irregularities of the underlying data set. If we look at a normal or a log normal fit, or basically any other distribution, it's hiding those underlying characteristics. So we're masking what the data actually looks like in favor of a more simple distribution. And through this research, we show that KDE across different ranges of data sets more closely adheres to that underlying data. So more often than not, it is the closest fit to the data. So how do we use KL1 in a probabilistic whole building LCA? So if I do an LCA using this method, what does it actually look like? So step 1, if we're doing an LCA of a building, we need to get our material quantities for the building, same as a normal LCA. Then we obtain sets of embodied carbon coefficients for all of those materials. So we look at which embodied carbon coefficients might be relevant for our material queries. Then we use KDE to create our probabilistic ECC models. From there, we use a technique called Monte Carlo simulation to perform our probabilistic LCA. Now, basically what that looks like is we have a series of distributions. We randomly sample from each of those. We multiply it by the material quantity, and we get a result. But then we repeat that process, randomly sampling, multiplying, and we get a set of, let's say, 10,000 results. And so then those 10,000 results would reflect our range of expected results, really, because we've randomly sampled from all our input distributions. So this is what we think is a reasonable take on the range of expected results. So for the results, so we're looking at whole building embodied carbon intensity. So what do we think oh, and sorry, when I say embodied carbon intensity, we calculate our whole embodied carbon, we divide it by the floor area of the building. Some people use conditioned floor area, some people use gross floor area. In this one, we use conditioned floor area. But yeah, so we have our set of expected values for whole building embodied carbon intensity. We can also look at embodied carbon intensity for each material. And then we can perform a sensitivity analysis to see which materials contribute the most to uncertainty. So the 2 kind of main metrics that we're concerned about is not just which materials contribute the most to embodied carbon, but also which materials contribute the most to uncertainty. So we get these data from EC3. EC3 is from Building Transparency, you might have heard of. It's basically an online repository of EPDs focused in the building sector. So it has all these different material categories. So that's where we're getting our information. Now what this process looks like, we basically pull all EPDs we think might be relevant using a characteristic such as master format code. We make sure these EPDs are aligned in scope. Thinking back to the beginning, we make sure it's just A1 to A3, so we're comparing apples to apples. We align by declared unit, so we want to make sure, again, that we're creating a probabilistic model with similar values. They have to be all aligned by unit. We'll investigate outliers, remove irrelevant EPDs. So sometimes there might be a product that's not necessarily reflective of what we expect. So those would be removed from our probabilistic model. And then with our remaining data set for each material, we apply KDE. So when we apply KDE, this is where we get our probabilistic ECC models for each material. And here's what that looks like for the different materials in this building. Now we're showing these results alongside deterministic LCA values or ECC values from Athena, OneClick, and Tally. So you can see those kind of nestled in these probabilistic models just to show how closely they align with kind of industry expectations. But this is what we're using. So when I mentioned the Monte Carlo simulation, so we randomly sample from each of these distributions, multiply it by the quantity, add them up, and then repeat that process to get a range of expected results. Again, our two important metrics here. So there's embodied carbon. There's also variance of embodied carbon intensity. So when we look at the range of expected results, it's interesting to see that the three deterministic tools that we use fit kind of nicely within our distribution. But this is telling us how, based on what we know about these materials, based on our ECC queries, what we would expect the range of results to look like for whole building embodied carbon intensity. Now, the next step is splitting this up by material. So which materials contribute the most to embodied carbon, which materials contribute the most to uncertainty. And we do that by performing a sensitivity analysis. So you can see the results kind of along the right side of that plot reflected in the uncertainty index. And so right now they're ranked by which materials contribute the most to uncertainty. And what's interesting here is like XPS has a lot of uncertainty with it associated with it, but it's not always the highest emitting material. You can see concrete, which is fifth from the top, has a much tighter distribution, but it's generally higher than the other ones. It has a much higher median. So just because concrete is the greatest contributor to embodied carbon doesn't mean it's the greatest contributor to variance. So in this case, when I say the sensitivity analysis results are actionable and iterative, what I mean is if we're performing this LCA, let's say in early stage design, what this tells us is if I want to tighten up that plot on the left, if I want to get a more precise take on my whole building embodied carbon intensity, I need to focus on XPS and fiberglass bat and rebar in terms of those underlying ECC distributions. Now, refining that query could mean kind of digging into the ECC models we created. It could mean looking at the EPDs. Are these all reflective? Do I maybe know what manufacturer I'm getting this from? Do I know what location I'm getting it from? What does our data look like? And so the iterative nature of this is that it's telling me that I need to kind of sharpen my pencil when it comes to the underlying XPS data. Now, another way to think about this is if I can't really sharpen my pencil in terms of the XPS, maybe my data is not good enough to yield the conclusions I want to yield, because surely that should be an answer some of the time. If my data is not good enough, my analysis should tell me that my data is not good enough to make a certain conclusion. Like if we want to say our whole building embodied carbon intensity is below 100 kilograms of CO2 per square meter, it's like, well, yeah, maybe some of the time, but we might need to refine this. We might need to sharpen our pencil and refine this graph to say so with more confidence. So conclusions from this process of developing and applying KL1. So we know that KDE more closely fits the data when we compare to parametric distributions like normal or log normal or other distributions like that. Probabilistic LCA in general is data-driven and actionable. So it's telling us which materials have the highest embodied carbon. It's also telling us which materials have the highest variance. It drives us towards more data transparency by highlighting that uncertainty. So from a designer's perspective, it gives me leverage to say, well, I need better XPS data. I need better this data. And so I can ask my manufacturers or material suppliers, whoever it might be, with a more specific question to say, this is where I know I need data, and I don't focus on the materials that don't matter as much. Now, EPDs are limited, but they're also increasing. More and more people are producing EPDs. So as we get more and more EPDs, these models will only improve. They will have more data to rely on. They will do a better job reflecting what's the expected range of results. However, digitizing EPDs is not a perfect process. They don't always have the right data features, so sometimes we have to discard EPDs if we can't convert it to the right units or to the right lifecycle scope, let's say. We're also taking each EPD at face value by using identical kernels. So when we showed how we kind of add the kernel on top of each value, each of those kernels is the same, but maybe that shouldn't be the case. Because by making those kernels identical, we're not considering important EPD features like material production quantities. So if different EPDs are responsible for different amounts of material in the market, maybe that should be reflected in the model. Product level uncertainty. I kind of showed how EPDs vary in scope depending on how much generic or how much product specific or supply chain specific data is used. Maybe that should be reflected in our probabilistic model. Also, there's data not represented by EPDs. So how much of the market is captured by these EPDs? What do we do about data that's not represented by EPDs? And then desired metrics such as the ECCIA, so that's industry average embodied carbon coefficient. So there are industry groups like the NRMCA or other groups that come up with these industry averages, but they're often using proprietary data that's not shared with the public. And so if they have, let's say, better data than we do, should we rely more heavily on their average than our average, or what's available in the data? How can we use maybe a better average to improve our models? So all of these are very important considerations in how we're improving upon KL1. So now we're at KL2, KDE-driven LCA version 2. So we're trying to accommodate all these additional layers of information. So material production quantities, product level uncertainty, data not represented by EPDs, and desired metrics such as the industry average ECC. So the cool thing about KDE is we have two kind of principal components that we can manipulate, and that's the bandwidth and the weight. So the weight is basically the size of each kernel. Right now, they're all the same. The bandwidth is the width of each kernel. So in this case, because it's a normal distribution, it's the standard deviation of that kernel. So what if the bandwidths were different? What if they reflected kind of underlying uncertainty characteristics that we're already tracking, like how reliable is the data, how complete is the data, when was it produced, where was it produced, and what kind of technology was used? And so whether that is product specific or industry average or generic, that might inform how confident we are, and that would inform the width of each of those kernels that we use. Now, similarly, we can adjust the weight. So rather than having the exact same weight, what if the size of each kernel was reflected by production quantity data that captures, let's say, cost or volume or weight or some sort of aspect that reflects the amount of material from each EPD? So in a perfect world, we have a complete data set of EPDs. There is no unrepresented data. We know the exact amount of generic and product specific data for each EPD, and we know the exact amount of material produced by each EPD. And this is what that looks like. So we have different sized kernels that directly reflect all of these qualities. But that is entirely unrealistic. EPDs don't really have specific weights. We're not always going to know all these different features, but this is kind of that gold standard that we're aiming at. But because we're not likely to have all this information, what can we do? So if kernel weights or the material quantities are unconstrained, we basically have infinite combinations. So if we don't necessarily know that they're equal, but we don't know what they should be, well, there are infinite answers to that. In this kind of made up case, we have 9 values. So how many ways can 9 values add up to 100%? And how does that change what the probabilistic model looks like? So basically what we can do is we can explore different solutions in this space. We can explore different viable combinations of these weights that fit our constraints. So if we don't know anything about the weights, we're going to explore all possible combinations. And at this point, basically what we have uncertainty about our uncertainty. So if we're saying we don't know what these weights could be, here are all the combinations that they might be. here's how much our resulting probabilistic model changes. So here's kind of the fuzziness around that probabilistic model that lets us know how confident we should be in it. And by randomly sampling through these weights, here we have 9 values. So each of them, we're assuming we don't know that one might be bigger than the other. So they have the same average of 11.1%. But we're randomizing how we combine them. And so this is every feasible, or exploring all feasible solutions of 9 values that add up to 100%. But if we think about how we might actually get material production quantities, they're usually in some sort of aggregated format. So here's an example for steel. So to get steel production data, World Steel produces it by country. So if we look at steel by country, then that's kind of our subgroup that we can consider. So we have total steel, we have an amount of steel from the US, that's 4.2% of global steel production. If we have 66 EPDs, what we can do is we can kind of vary the weights of those 66 EPDs such that they always equal 4.2%. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that. So in this instance, rather than exploring all of the weights separately, we can explore in groups. So if we know group 1, these 3 values represents 60% of the data set, then we randomly sample from these 3 values, so that with a mean of 20%, in all different ways that 3 values can add up to 60%. Now, if the second group, the other 6 values, adds up to 40%, we do the same thing separately with those values. And then that's reflected in our model. So in every single instance of this model, the group 1 adds up to 60%, group 2 adds up to 40%, but we're exploring different viable combinations of those weights, because that's kind of how we get our material production data. Now we have 2 other things to account for. So unrepresented data and the industry average ECC. But let's kind of recap what we've covered this far. So the first version of KL1 doesn't consider important EPD features. KL2, we're trying to accommodate that. So material production quantities, that corresponds to kernel weight, or the size of the kernel. If they're unknown or we have grouped weights, we explore multiple viable weight combinations given those constraints. Product level uncertainty, so depending on how much generic or supply chain specific data we have, that corresponds to kernel bandwidth, or the width of each kernel. Now the 2 remaining bits, data not represented by EPDs and desired metrics such as the industry average ECC. So our problem is if we apply uniform kernels, that doesn't necessarily result in the resulting plot does not necessarily have an expected value equal to our industry average ECC. But if we have unrepresented data, what if we simulate that unrepresented data such that the expected value of the resulting plot is equal to our industry average ECC? So we're kind of using that as our target expected value, and then we're simulating this phantom kernel that captures unrepresented data. So if my EPDs represent, let's say, 80% of the market, then that phantom kernel would have a weight of 20%, and we would put it in a place such that the expected value is equal to our target, our industry average ECC. So as a proof of concept, we apply this method to global steel EPDs like I was just showing. So we have a number of EPDs from all these different countries. Here you can see both the proportion of steel production and also the number of EPDs we have from each country. So for the US, again, we have 66 EPDs, it's 4.2% of production. So those 66 values will always add up to 4.2% of the weight. Now, because our representativeness here is only 17%, we have a lot of uncertainty associated with our resulting probabilistic model. So basically what this tells us is we need to get more data. We need to have more representative data. And one of the big reasons for this was that like China is responsible for something like 50% of the steel production, and we didn't have any EPDs from China. But what this tells us is if we're going to use these data to create a probabilistic model, it's not necessarily that reliable yet. And so it's good to get that feedback that we're understanding the uncertainty about our uncertainty, basically. Now, conclusions from developing and applying KL2. So we have all these different shortcomings of KL1. So we have material production quantities that correspond to kernel weight, product level uncertainty that corresponds to kernel bandwidth. And now we're simulating our unrepresented data as a phantom kernel. And we're using the industry average ECC to place that phantom kernel to figure out where we think that might go. However, the added complexity of this method maybe makes it less accessible. Now, that being said, I am optimistic that this could be packaged in a way that is such that building designers are only interfacing with the method in a way that is meaningful to them, meaning you don't have to get a master's degree in statistics. You just have to define your material queries. You just have to understand things that you should already know as a building designer about your materials. Now, this is subject, again, to available EPDs, whether the materials you're using are reflected by that and being able to parse in the right way. But we're accounting for a lot more information, so we're creating a much more robust probabilistic model. So in terms of future research, what we want to figure out, so up until this point, we started with KL1, we've developed KL2, but now we want to see if accounting for these different things substantially changes our LCA results. So there are different ways that we can incorporate these different features. So we could, like, as we did in KL1, we could apply KDE with uniform weighting. We could also fit a normal distribution. We can also fit a log normal distribution. We can also consider variable weighting. So not necessarily iterating different examples between them, but what if these weights are different? But we can use that to fit a normal distribution and a log normal distribution. And then we have our Dirichlet weighting. Dirichlet refers to that process of kind of exploring multiple options. But again, we can do that with normal and log normal. So what we want to investigate is basically, does it matter that we're using KDE? Does it matter that we're using Dirichlet weighting? Does it matter that we're using variable weighting? Which of these combine in the right way for different statistical or different types of data sets? Like, when does it meaningfully change our results? Going back to performing that probabilistic LCA, we're thinking about which materials contribute the most to uncertainty, which materials contribute the most to embodied carbon. So how often do the answers to those questions change when we use different probabilistic models? Other future research that we're doing, so we're trying to see how receptive the building industry is to these kinds of advanced methods, such as probabilistic LCA. So we're doing a surveying and interview study. So it's a semi-structured interview. So we basically have a list of topics and questions that we kind of let the conversation drive itself. And we want to see, how do people generally perform LCA? What's missing? What's frustrating? What problems do they have? And also, how might these advanced methods fit in? So the topics that we're considering, like, how did you learn to do LCAs? Why do you perform LCAs? Is it because it's a lead requirement? Is it a government requirement? Is it to keep up with other firms? Is it because you're signed on to SE 2050? And then just walking through the process of doing an LCA, figuring out what aspects are most important. Is it important that you have a Revit model? Is it important that you model things correctly? And then what's done with results, whether it's internal tracking, submitting to clients, including it on your drawings, submitting it to SE 2050 or AIA 2030. And then getting thoughts on advanced methods like probabilistic LCA and dynamic LCA. I haven't talked about dynamic LCA today. It's about biogenic carbon, but not just focusing on probabilistic LCA, but seeing how people feel about other advanced methods. And yeah, generally on, like, how do people feel about advanced LCA? Are people totally turned off by it? Are they excited about different methods? What are people's priorities in terms of tool functionality? Does it need to be a Revit plugin? Does it need to spit out pretty graphs? What do people tend to prioritize? And then, yeah, open floor to complain. What problems do people experience while doing LCAs? So to give an overview of the different methods of uncertainty modeling, and I'll be happy to answer any questions. So kind of how it's generally done in practice, we have deterministic LCA where you just have a single unchanged value. Now a little bit better than that is fitting a distribution, but usually whatever distribution you use is unsubstantiated. You haven't proven that the data is meant to follow anything. You're just kind of picking something for convenience. And it's often hiding or masking the statistical characteristics of the data. There's KL1 where we apply KDE with uniform kernels, uniform bandwidths. And then we improve upon that with KL2, where we're accounting for different weights, we're accounting for different bandwidths, the representativeness of the data, the industry average ECCs, and then thinking about future work. So do different probabilistic models change LCA-driven decisions, like variance and which materials contribute the most to variance and embodied carbon? How can we make KL2 more accessible? So do we need to package this in some sort of software? Does it need to be like Revit compatible? And then what common barriers do LCA practitioners experience? What are the problems that they have? What motivations do they have? and what features do they prioritize in their tools. But thank you guys so much for having me. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions. And yeah, I mean, part of this work, we're also trying to figure out, yeah, exactly how it gets packaged, how we can make it accessible. That doesn't exist right now, but hopefully there will be some sort of like preliminary platform where you can at least play with this. Because a lot of it just comes down to like, how do we pull the EPDs? How do we parse through them? How do we check the quality? How do we make sure they align? And then spit out a nice fancy report without making you do too much work.
Do you see this as something that could be integrated into the software tools we're already using? Because I know, like, for me, one weakness that I find in some of the tools that I use is like, I know that there are EPDs out there, but they are not available in the specific LCA tool that I'm using.
Yeah, so I mean, I think a big part of this would be kind of making those EPD data more accessible to people, so you have a better understanding of, well, what's informing these decisions. Like, we have tens of thousands of EPDs for concrete, but like for that first analysis, we only had 3 for dimensional lumber. And so having a bit more transparency, so not only do we have the probabilistic model, but you can see, oh, like here's where my EPDs are coming from, here's how many there are, here are the different manufacturers they're considering. I think that level of transparency where you understand who's producing EPDs and what they represent goes a long way in terms of helping people have more confidence in their results. And I know we're introducing uncertainty, so it kind of obscures the results and maybe you can't make as direct of a conclusion. Like you just want to say, oh, I have 11.6357% reduction if I use this design option. But the reality is like, well, maybe your data is not good enough to be that confident. Okay, what are your thoughts on using AI/ML to parse the EPD and other secondary data? I mean, I think in this space, transparency and traceability is extremely important. And so there are different AI platforms out there that kind of will give you their best guess at what an emissions factor should be. And I don't love that, because if it's not traceable, if you don't know where it's coming from, you don't know what assumptions are made, then it's not super useful. I think AI seems to be really good at language processing. So if we can use AI to improve the digitization of EPDs, I think that could be really valuable in terms of picking apart the different assumptions that are made. As long as it's like verified, it's traceable, we make sure that it's coming up with the right answers. Thinking about machine learning separately, I think where machine learning has a really strong application. So these EPDs, when you pull an EPD from EC3, it has like 1,000 data features, some of which are very useless, like the specific address of like the third-party verifier. But some of them are like the manufacturer location, like different important features of the EPD. So where I think machine learning comes in is to do some sort of like feature importance analysis. And what that basically does is kind of considering a specific target objective, so my embodied carbon coefficient, and then considering these other things like manufacturer location, whatever else, which of these other features best predict that? So does the embodied carbon coefficient correlate best with manufacturer or location? Is it important that I know if it's for steel, let's say electric arc furnace versus basic oxygen furnace? And so that, I think ML has a very strong application there, because it does a better job describing the data. It's not as black boxy necessarily as a large language model is. So yeah, I think ML has strong applications. I haven't explicitly explored AI as much yet.
Hey, Martin, it's
So
Dirk.
another
Good.
Hey, Dirk.
Great job. A question that builds on, so a question I was going to ask you to your first one, and then it builds on Laura's. One, this is all, I mean, way more rigorous than what's going on right now. So the question you asked, you posed some kind of to us of, does it need to go into Revit? Does it, like, what types of things would make it operational? I was going to kind of throw to the group also, what do we think needs to happen to help the market understand that this is different and more valuable? Because the chart, whether a donut or pie or whichever way, looks the same, right? These numbers look the same, but they're different. But then the other one, as far as the doing more of this and the EPD not being available, that many will say, like, you shouldn't even be comparing EPDs, right? If we got because even if they're from the PCR, there's assumptions that were made by the person who made the EPD. Now, did you look at how perhaps this could get around that, or could help to ease some of those concerns? Because if we have, there's two major softwares that make the concrete EPDs. all those that seem like absolute data points in EC3, but really there's uncertainty baked into each of those numbers at another level. So I was curious your thoughts on how this kind of approach might help with those concerns as well.
Yeah, great question. So I think about this kind of in two different ways. So where I've been applying this has been kind of at the EPD level up. So we're doing an LCA of a building using EPD data, but an EPD is its own LCA that's reliant on elementary flows and unit processes. And like, well, what's the electricity grid mix? What was this industrial process? What are the emissions factor with those? And I think the same method could be applied in the same way at that level. So rather than making, let's say, a generic assumption about my electricity grid mix, I could like, well, if we don't know the electricity grid mix, here's what it could be. And that's an input to my EPD that would result, like the result of the EPD would be probabilistic. And so we could connect it to these underlying flows. The reason I do it in this way is if somebody was tasked with creating probabilistic, like if as from a building designer's perspective, if you're creating probabilistic models of all these underlying elementary flows, that's just too much work. It's not feasible. So in tandem with kind of this method, like we're relying on EPDs, we want these to be produced. This is how we're accounting for uncertainty. We want more transparency in those EPDs. So where did you get your electricity grid mix? What assumptions are you making in terms of the industrial process? In this context, that would inform the kernel bandwidth. But it's like kind of the same method could be applied at that level, but it's kind of being sold to a different group of people. Like this is very focused on building designers. That would be for the EPD operators and the people that are producing those. And so what that would get at is rather than a single value EPD, we would kind of have a probabilistic model as our EPD. So great question. That's kind of how I thought about it, but I haven't quite dug into the EPD level just yet. Ramana asked, there are experts out there who feel there's too much emphasis on quantification, not enough on absolute reduction. Thoughts? Yeah, I mean, I think a very valid criticism of jumping through all these hoops is like, you're just going to turn people off and people are going to say, well, if I was doing it wrong anyway, why the hell would I do an LCA at all? I mean, yeah, there are strategies that we know are going to reduce embodied carbon. If you're optimizing your structure, like you don't have to worry about the uncertainty of it. It's like less material is better, right? And so I think this is beneficial for portions of the industry that are more interested in getting kind of, sharpening the pencils, because the same way that I was motivated to get into this is like, if I do an LCA with two different tools, I get two different answers. I think there are people in industry that are starting to understand that. And so if we normalize thinking about this in that way, I think that stands to benefit not necessarily everybody, but certainly some of maybe the like kind of high impact or highly interested users of LCA tools. I think it aligns quite nicely the same way, like if you're doing an LCA in Tally, you have to say this is the type of you have to associate each material with something in Tally. This would be the same thing. You're just associating with it with a specific like material query. And then it lets you scrutinize that a bit better rather than just being stuck with a single option for whatever material.
This definitely seems like something that the sort of LCA nerd power users would be very into. And folks who have a lot of other design issues on their plate maybe want to say like, I want an easier answer. Do I choose this material or that material, this product or that product? Do you see this kind of research, if more people are doing LCAs this way, as providing maybe some clearer insights for the folks who in kind of the broader industry who aren't going to want to go as deep, but kind of want some guidance as to what might we expect to learn from this that could help guide them on a more basic level?
So when I'm thinking about how this, because I'm sort of showing y'all like letting you peek under the hood, this is how the method works. When I'm imagining how this would be implemented, I mean, I would want full transparency in terms of people who do want to dig under the hood, but it would be much more explicit in terms of providing, like we saw the graph of like uncertainty index, here's what contributes the most to embodied carbon or the most to variance. But those takeaways can be packaged in a very like non-statisticsy way. Like you can just kind of have a list of materials where this is your highest variance, this is your highest embodied carbon, here are some recommended next steps, let's say. So I'm optimistic that it could communicate that clearly to people who don't necessarily want to peek under the hood. But one of the things that I'm kind of particular, or one of the things I'm responding to, if you're using industry average data and the material supplier that you're using is, let's say, doesn't have an EPD or they have really high embodied carbon materials or products, they basically get to just hide behind an industry average value. They have no incentive to produce a specific value. But if you, by using an industry average data point, if you are burdened by the uncertainty associated with that, then they can no longer hide behind that. Then your conclusion is, well, you need to get better data. You ask that supplier, hey, I need better data. Then you maybe go to material supplier A instead of material supplier B because they're giving you data. So I think it drives you, rather than hiding behind a deceptively precise industry average, it kind of forces their hand. And so that's one thing that has to be a conclusion some of the time, where if I'm not getting the data that I need to make my conclusion, it's like, well, what if you have really high embodied carbon material suppliers? So hopefully this would push, like, give a little bit more leverage to say, well, if I can't do this analysis, then I need to go with XYZ. That's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping this is arming or equipping building designers with another tool to say, like, well, this is what I need. I need better data for XPS. I'm going to ask my XPS supplier, okay, I need to go with this other one. So that's the kind of like push towards data transparency that I was referring to.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And a really important point about especially the suppliers with higher embodied carbon intensity sort of hiding behind the industry average EPD.
Even taking that to Dirk's point earlier about, like, well, what's happening at the EPD level? What kind of data are people using? If we can start to shine a light there as well and get more transparency, like what elementary flows, what unit processes went into this? What assumptions did you make about your electricity grid mix, or what, I keep using that as an example, but whatever industrial process fed into the EPD, then we can start shining a light on that too. Because I think all of this comes down to like data transparency, to how much we know about our materials and about our data should be reflected in our results. And so if we don't know much, then maybe we have pretty wide error bars. As we learn more, we get more narrow error bars.
It'll be interesting also to see how this gets communicated to the clients that we're doing LCAs for. I know somebody in the chat complimented your beautiful graphs. And I think that visual communication of this is going to be really important when we're kind of making decisions and communicating with the broader kind of design teams and owners and stakeholders in the process.
Yeah, 100%. And that, I mean, through the interviews that we've already been doing, that is a common thing, that the trend that we found already is like, well, this seems cool, it might be more accurate, but how the hell do I tell my clients about it? And so it might be only in certain instances, only with certain clients, or used internally, or just you kind of focus on the high level takeaways, where here's my list of highest contributing materials, here's my list of highest contributors to variance. And if people think of questions after, like, I mean, I've been working on this for many years, so I'm happy to keep talking about it. So if anybody comes up with questions after, you can just find me on LinkedIn and send me a message. If you want to read about it, the first study, the KL1 study, is published. The KL2, we're kind of approaching completion, so probably hopefully in a couple months it'll be published. So you can read about it if you want.
All right. Well, I think we will wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Martín, for sharing this with the CLF-LA group. And thanks everybody for your great questions. And we'll see you all next time.
Thanks so much, Martín.
Thanks, y'all. That was fun.